Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's sold-out discussion is titled Environmental History, Eating the City, and we'll be joined led by Matthew Booker, who's a professor of history at North Carolina State University, just down the road from me in Raleigh, and Kimberly Gilman, a middle and high school teacher in Shawnee Mission School District in Kansas. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center. I'm joining you tonight from my home in Chapel Hill. I am flying solo, actually. Normally, I'm joined by Libby Taylor, my colleague, who is really our primary point person with you, our audience, for these webinars. But I'm pleased to say that Libby delivered her third child last Friday, and she's going to be sitting out with maternity leave for a few months, actually. So instead, I'll be running the webinar tonight by myself, and my job will be to moderate the discussion, to try to insert and find the questions and the thoughts that you have and share them with both Matthew and Kimberly as we go along. But I'm fortunate to have two of them tonight, and I think it's a special model that we're joining scholar and teacher to address this topic. And I'm going to ask both of them, when they're not leading the primary PowerPoint, to feel free to curate your questions and make comments in that chat box. The chat box is located in the lower portion of the Go to Training control panel. If you open up, you'll see your name and everyone else's name, and we really do encourage you to share your thoughts, to share resources, to share good ideas, to ask questions. You do that to everyone. You can also do that to individuals. So if you know some folks in the room, if you have gotten to know people over time, please feel free to have those kinds of private conversations. And again, because both Matthew and Kimberly are with us tonight, feel free to ping them privately and maybe have a little back channel conversation about the kinds of things that we're sharing tonight. The National Humanities Center is dedicated to the advancement of the humanities, and we do so in a variety of ways. I see our education work as being a bridge between the scholarly world and the practical world of teaching and learning. All of our initiatives, whether they're online and digital or face-to-face, are designed to put teachers and scholars together in conversation and really to spend time thinking through complex and compelling topics, but also thinking about how to unlock those with audiences of all ages. We are very pleased to have Matthew as one of our fellows last year. We pried the keys away from his hands last May when he finished his fellowship, but he's been an outstanding contributor to many of our education and outreach initiatives. And ultimately, what we try to do is find as many relevant and opportunistic ways to connect those two worlds. And I think what we find over time is that it's not outreach in terms of us bringing scholarship or content to you, the teachers, but it's inreach as well, meaning what you have to share, what you have to contribute, what we can co-create and develop together is much more important and really affects the scholarship in a very deep and very meaningful way. In some of those cases, that means developing exemplar lessons. As many of you might know, our free and open lessons at americanclass.org give you a chance to see stellar and exemplar models on a variety of topics. At this point, they're primarily history and literature focused, but we've been working very hard to expand our role in all of the humanities disciplines, and I think tonight's webinar is a good example of that. Our webinar series is an opportunity to invite you to join us in conversation and to really spend time not only with the scholars themselves, but with all the associated materials that they put together for you. I would find that the PowerPoints and the readings and the primary source documents are just as valuable as the actual conversation, and we do hope that that you grab those, that you remix them, that you find ways to share them with your younger students. In fact, it might be interesting at sometimes if you're ever interested in either assigning a webinar to one of your classes, to some of your students, either as extra credit or as some kind of extension activity, or take our recording and slice it up a little bit and maybe offer that as prompts for the various work that you do. Our webinars are very popular. We're selling many of our scheduled sessions out, including tonight's. And I would encourage you to go to our website and sign up for any for the rest of the semester that you think might be of interest. As I mentioned, we also host face-to-face events at the center. Our next big institute will be in July 2018. We'll be studying the contested territory, America's role in Southeast Asia during those years that bookend the American involvement in Vietnam. If you're interested in this, please complete an application and submit that through the National Endowment for the Humanities. We'll be selecting 36 teachers from around the country. We'll bring you to Durham. We'll have a wonderful experience with a whole slate of top and elite scholars in the field and really explore in great depth the cultural landscape of Southeast Asia. We try hard to make sure that our work is relevant for the classroom. We do want this to be not just work that you learn sort of on the side, but that can be deeply ingrained in the way that you approach your teaching. In some cases, that's curricular, and I hope you find ways, including tonight, to tie this to what you teach. In some ways, it might be extracurricular, meaning there are conversations that you have with your colleagues, with your children, with students, in all those margins of your day, at lunch and in the hallway and at bus duty. And ideally, our webinars will give you a chance to have just more content knowledge and more interdisciplinary connections that you can share with them. We do rely heavily on our Teachers Advisory Council to help us make sure that the work we're creating in what sometimes can be the silo of the National Humanities Center is relevant and meaningful for your classrooms. And we would encourage you to think about joining this council for the 2018-19 school year if you're interested. Participation tonight is being documented. We really appreciate you taking time after your busy day in front of classes, in front of students. As you can tell from the growing chat box right now, we have teachers and participants from literally across the country. We've got a very strong cohort from California and Southern California, as well as New York, which ironically is going to trace the map a little bit for what Matthew's going to share with you tonight from that coast to west coast voyage of the Oyster. When we complete tonight's session, you will be prompted to complete a survey. And once that survey is completed, you'll be able to download your certificate for your time here. If you ever run into any problems, please give us an email. Give us about a day or so to make sure that our automatically generated email reaches you. But if you don't have that, or if you need help, I'd be more than happy to troubleshoot from this end. So as a framing and introduction, in fact, many details many of you have heard, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce a topic tonight, a theme tonight, an approach tonight that I think goes beyond the content. The environmental humanities is a very strong emerging field in the scholarly world. The National Humanities Center, in fact, will be hosting a multi-day conference on the environmental humanities in spring of 2019. We're seeing lots of scholarly work come from this idea that the human footprint and the physical footprint, the physical landscape, and as they interact can tell us many different things. It also implies to me some very significant work that you can imagine doing with colleagues of yours across fields. So often we get stuck in the myopic classroom that we teach in, and it's hard enough to work with folks in our discipline, much less other humanities teachers, much less folks who make in the sciences or in the STEM fields. But I think what we really want to offer you tonight is not just an hypothesis, not just a possibility or some intellectual exercise, but we want to show you some very real, some very tangible, and some very meaningful ways to connect curricula from the humanities to the sciences world. Kimberly is going to be sharing with you from her perspective as a teacher. In fact, she left kids today as well, on the ways that might happen. What Matthew's going to do is ground all of that with some strong scholarly work. And again, I think that's the value that we have to offer, which is this isn't just us trying to make up these connections, but rather there's a very meaningful body of work that's being developed both at the university level, through research, through different kinds of digital projects and the use of emerging technology tools, but also that it works really well with kids. It works really well in expanding your curriculum. And I think we'll offer you many different examples of just what that looks like. As it turns out, tonight's webinar is also the product of an initiative that we've started at the National Humanities Center. Titled Humanities in Class, we are moments away from publishing an iBook compilation that asks scholars and teachers from 10 different disciplines to work together to make visible the process of their discipline. We really wanted them to think about and to articulate how they go about understanding very particular disciplinary approaches and disciplinary fluencies. And one of our team, one of our pairs, two of our partners in this project that we started last summer were in fact Matthew and Kimberly, and they had a chance to work closely together. I encourage you to go to our website. You can follow the links in our education programs to find this project. And there's a wonderful video posted just today, in fact, of Matthew and Kimberly having this conversation. You'll also see the other 9 disciplines that we use this same making visible approach in, including philosophy and music, literature studies, geography, political theory, etc. And this iBook will be free for download in the iTunes store probably within the next 7 to 10 days. from my perspective, what that means is it gives us an opportunity to really think about these connections. And tonight we're going to offer you some specific content on how that might work. So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome both Matthew and Kimberly to our webinar tonight. Matthew, are you there? Can you hear me? And if you are, Matthew, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself before. Hey, Matthew, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear
you. Hey, thank you. Give me 1 second. I'm going to bring Kimberly as well. Hey, Kimberly, can you hear me? Kimberly's not quite green, but Matthew, I'm going to invite you to go ahead and get started. I'm going to hand you the mouse, and I think you're going to at least start this conversation, and I'll work with Kimberly behind the scenes to make sure that she's online as well. So, Matthew, thanks for joining us. Please take it away.
All right, thank you, Andy, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of Kimberly, who's going to be with us in a moment and introduce herself, I just want to welcome you to this webinar and to say what a pleasure it is to be a part of this event. I'm an environmental historian at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, and my first book is a history of San Francisco Bay, which is where I backed into this story of the Atlantic oyster, in that case, the Atlantic oyster in the Pacific, mostly through the work of Jack London, a novelist who escaped from a factory and from the industrial grind of the late 19th century by borrowing money from his African-American nurse, childhood friend, and buying a sailboat so he could steal oysters. So that story, which is fascinating and bizarre, led me into the larger world of oysters in the city. And that has become a great focus for my work these days on how people ate and how they adapted themselves to the changing conditions of the industrial city as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. So here at North Carolina State, I also direct the Science, Technology, and Society program. And I was a National Humanities Center Fellow last year, where I started writing this book about oysters in the city. And it is true, as Andy said, that I had to be pried out of there. It's a wonderful space, and hope you can visit. So forgive me if I cough or sneeze. I'm just getting over the end of a cold that I think many of us have had everywhere. What I want to do now, though, is pass the microphone over to my colleague, Kim Gilman, so she can introduce herself and give us a sense of the agenda for tonight.
Kimberly, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Very, very well, thank you. Thanks for joining us from Kansas.
Yes, absolutely. I'll introduce myself a little bit. I see some comments that the audio is struggling a little bit, so I'm hoping that everybody can hear me there. As mentioned, I had this great opportunity to work with Matthew and with Andy at the center this summer, and we started working in one direction, and then we've kind of transferred over our camaraderie into this project here that we have for you tonight. I regularly teach pre-AP history and geography to about 150 middle schoolers. And the reason it's pre-AP is because my students have kind of low socioeconomic and high income, which means they are going to have a very possibly going to be as successful in these classes. So really, we work a lot with evidence and with writing and communication skills, with argumentation and those kind of things that will help them be more successful. And I got into the environmental humanities really through some study tours that I took to Germany and Asia that are available for educators. And when I came back, I started trying to put some of these topics like sustainability and biodiversity into my curriculum, and I found actually it's not in my curriculum because I teach social studies and I'm in the humanities, and there's often kind of a disconnect, and I really wanted to find a connection. So I've had to be kind of creative at finding a connection to make the curriculum that I have the curriculum that I want. And some of you who are on the call, if you're educators, you may have those challenges as well. And so one of the things that we'll do at the end, Matthew's going to do some storytelling. He's a wonderful storyteller, and this is a fascinating story. And then at the end, what we're going to do is have a sort of interactive session that we'll go through and have you involved in doing some analysis and looking closer at some of the connections that we can find in this topic, and then maybe all the different topics you see on the screen. So this slide here that you're seeing has a number of different content areas, and I even saw someone in the chat box is a PE teacher. And so we've got all kinds of different content that we can look at, but what I'm going to ask you to do while Matthew is sharing with us is think about the connections that you might find in your topic area or in these topic areas that we have here loaded on the screen. And I love this quote by John Muir that talks about how everything is really connected. Everything that we look at is really tied to everything else. And so that's really what we're going to be doing today, or tonight, I should say.
Thanks, Kimberly. I'm going to do just a quick housekeeping note before we move on. And that is, this is one of the first times that we actually have two presenters. A couple of times in the past, we've invited a teacher and a scholar to present together, but this is one of the first times in a while. And I think what's happening, and I've noticed some comments in the chat box about the audio, is that Kimberly, I think you and Matthew are going to have to mute yourself if you're not speaking. I think we're getting some reverb from having too many mics open. What that means really is that don't forget to turn yourself back on when you begin to talk. So Matthew and Kimberly, I'm going to ask you to do that for yourself. And Matthew, I think you're going to take the mouse now.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Matthew and mute myself here.
Thanks. And it may be, Matthew, that I need to be the one unmuting you, so I'll make sure to do that. There you go.
Great, thank you. All right, well, thanks for your patience, everyone. I appreciate it. Yes, I do want to start by telling a story. We'll see if it's a story that's as interesting as Kimberly said. I hope so. I want to start by just saying something about the talk for today. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, maybe a little less, about this oysters world, the world of the oyster in the city. And my talk today is going to use the intertwined history of humans and this one particular, maybe somewhat odd food, oysters, as a way to explore a variety of intriguing questions about changes in American life. And for me, these are the great changes in American life at the turn of the 20th century. Urbanization, industrialization, immigration, and a shift towards industrial agriculture that's been going on since the middle of the 19th century. So in some ways, I think the genius of our species is our ability to intervene in the natural world to make it more productive for the things we want, sometimes even in ways that work out well, at least for a while. So that is a fundamental point of environmental history, that people change the world around them. And it's one I think we can see perhaps best through food. So this is a little thing, big thing story. The little thing is a humble animal, and the big thing is the story of the shift to the industrial city. So this first slide is a shot of the oyster's world, as I've chosen to call it here. It's that great green ribbon of seagrasses between high and low tide, stretching from Florida to Canada, centered on the urban estuaries of Long Island Sound, Delaware Bay, and the Chesapeake Bay. In that stretch are over 28,000 miles of shoreline washed by the tides. And also in that stretch today are about 50 million Americans. It's the most urbanized area of the United States, considered by demographers one vast mega city. Just 2% of the land area of the United States, but more than 17% of the US population. So it's simultaneously perhaps the richest ecological part of the eastern seaboard and the densest human inhabitation. And that combination is, I think, typical of our story for tonight. So the ecologists Howard and Eugene Odom found some decades ago that Atlantic coastal marshes are more productive than any other natural ecosystem on Earth. Far better at trapping energy than a rainforest, and almost as productive as a modern wheat field. And that's because while most soils on Earth are fairly nutrient poor, in the marshes, the tides circulate runoff from the land. Plants and animals thrive in the shallow, warm waters of the estuaries as the tides wash the runoff from above them from uphill back and forth. And so that's a good way to introduce us to our protagonist in this story. Let's see if I can advance the slide here. Okay, there we go. There's our protagonist, the hero of our story, Chrysostria virginica, the Atlantic oyster. The Eastern or New World oyster, as people often think of it. Oysters are perfectly adapted to those rewarding but sometimes harsh conditions of the coastal margin. They've often been called ecosystem engineers because they build on top of one another, as you can see in this beautiful slide from South Carolina's Hobcaw Creek. And they create reefs that support lots of other species through both inside the oyster clumps, but also by breaking the power of the waves, giving opportunities for marsh grasses to grow behind them, and so on. Oysters feed by filtering tiny plants from as much as 50 gallons of water per day per oyster. And so remember this about oyster biology as we start talking about people. Oysters thrive on fertilized water. That's their job, to take plants that thrive on fertilized waters and take them out and turn them into protein. So in fact, this is a nearly perfect food. High in protein, loaded with minerals and vitamins. 1/4 pound of oyster meat provides all your daily needs for zinc, selenium, vitamin B12, and also most of your iron, copper, and vitamin C. So bon appetit if you're an oyster lover. And that's a reminder too of another reality of biology, which is that oyster biology interacts and intersects with human biology in the sense that they are an almost perfect food for human beings. All right, let's see if I can advance. Whoops, I've advanced more than one slide, so I'm going to back up. All right. Let me back up so I can just say a couple more things about oysters here before I move on. Here we go. I've got a little delay on my screen, and so I'm racing ahead and then racing backward. What I wanted to say about oysters, though, is that Rowan Jacobson calls oysters the food that made us human. And what he means by that is that this high energy, dependable, abundant food supported human societies on every shoreline around the world. And that occurred at a particular moment in human evolution, sometime around 10,000 years ago, when modern sea levels changed radically due to the changing of the melting of the glaciers. As we enter into the current interglacial, you start seeing people backing up, moving away from the coasts, the distant coasts. And about 5,000 years ago, worldwide, people are able to once again settle densely along the edges of the water because the modern coastlines become more or less familiar and settled. And as that happens, everywhere around the world, on every coastline, you see these massive shale mounds develop. In the Americas, native peoples built mountains of oyster shells on both coasts, from Labrador and Alaska to Tierra del Fuego in the south. So oysters are a basic food of native peoples on both coasts, all three coasts of what is now the United States. When Europeans arrived, they were deeply impressed by Native American uses of shellfish. That's because European colonists to the Americas, to British North America, were also oyster people. They brought their traditions of carrying oysters to market for seasonal eating. But in the colonies, oysters were far more abundant than in Europe. What was already a specialty food in Paris and London was a staple for colonists. All right, there we go. The annual account books of John Adams, of George Washington, of Benjamin Franklin, of Thomas Jefferson, you name it, all of these men show that the founders ate oysters. They ate them with relish, and they ate them as much as they could get, not just in the holiday season, but by pickling them in other ways throughout the year. But with this image that we finally caught up to here, the organic city, 5 Points in what is now Manhattan in 1829, what this image shows us is that as the cities burgeoned, as they boomed in the 19th century in America, the United States, most Americans, even in the cities, still ate locally. They got their water and their food nearby, and they dumped their waste nearby. Now, it's hard to see on the scale of this image, but if you look very closely, there's a lot happening in this wonderful image here. But if you look very closely, there's a grocery store in the center, and written on the wall next to the doorway on the left is soft shell clams, and on the right is good fat hams. So a nice rhyme there. But on the right-hand side, there's another grocery store, and that one says oysters next to rum. So you have this mix of foods, some of them from distant places, luxuries like oranges on the far left, or perhaps that rum that comes from Caribbean sugar. But other portions of this food, much of the basic daily diet of Americans of the era, came from within a fairly local area of the city itself. And this is what Ted Steinberg, the historian Ted Steinberg, calls the organic city. It's this stinking, crowded, and partly self-sustaining kind of community in the early 19th and mid-19th century. So as population growth and immigration transformed what it meant to be an American, as for example, we see new immigrants from Ireland, as we see many more free African-American people in cities like New York, as we see the movement of rural people into the cities across the Americas, as all of that happens, what people ate also began to transform. So we know, I think all of you know very well about the transportation revolution, about the building of these canal systems, the steamboats that followed, and eventually railroads, which allowed rural products to reach the city. And so also did coastal products driven or boated or eventually pushed on railroad cars inland. So too did urban goods. And so the world could flow into places like Erie, Pennsylvania, or into ultimately even places like the interior of Utah. So the transportation revolution allowed urban goods to reach the interior, but not all goods could travel. And I think this is a point that we sometimes forget when we imagine the railroad, the greatest technology perhaps in American history, most transformative. We forget that the railroad too had its limits. For example, I know from my own work on California that cattle, live cattle, had a very difficult time making it across the country or even across the Sierra Nevada for many decades after the railroad was constructed. Railroads simply were too violent, too much shaking, the quality of the track in particular that the Central Pacific laid down, would shake cattle to death. They'd break their legs and die. It was very difficult to ship live stock by train long distances. Similarly, it was difficult to ship unrefrigerated goods long distances. So meat, for example, if you take that cow and cut it up, it's very difficult to transfer that long distances until refrigeration comes along. But there was one animal that could travel long distances with poor refrigeration, freezing winters and burning summers, and that, of course, was oysters. And that may seem strange, a shellfish that could travel across the Great Plains with barely any refrigeration in the midst of those conditions. But oysters are remarkable in that they close up at low tide and they survive. They can survive extraordinary changes in climate, from 100 degrees in the middle of a hot summer day to freezing temperatures on a winter day like this one. So this made oysters uniquely suited to long distance travel in the 19th century, and alone among the animal foods, oysters could travel alive across long distances. And so, for example, what this image reminds us is that towed night and day by oxen at a sedate 4 miles per hour, live oysters could move uphill and overland on the artificial river of the Erie Canal. By the 1830s, you could buy live oysters in Buffalo. Oysters were conquering space in ways that seem remarkable today.
Matthew, let me ask you a quick question.
Yes.
You describe the role of the oyster, and you've set it up nicely in terms of the role that it plays moving. Do you have any sense that we as humans were aware of the scale and the reach of what you're describing, or was it happening literally sort of underneath us, and it's hard to see the clouds move when you're underneath them?
Well, that's a that's such a great question because, you could ask the same thing about our lives today, right? To what
Exactly.
extent?
Well, that's right.
To what extent do we understand the technological transformations that are remaking our lives? When in 20 years from now, will we look back and say, boy, that whole Twitter, Facebook thing was just a passing fad. But what really mattered was the AI and the surveillance cameras. We don't really know. Or is kombucha going to be the great food of the 21st century? So for everyday people, I think it was tough for them always to see these transformations. But then in other ways, of course, there were remarkable dramatic changes that were hard to ignore. And the example actually of the oysters that I've been here on the Erie Canal comes from Carol Sheriff's wonderful book, The Artificial River. And for them, for the people of Buffalo, being able to buy oysters, thanks to the Erie Canal, was a very big deal. A very big deal. They remarked on it. They wrote about it in the newspapers. They had a giant party. Oysters were a familiar food of the Atlantic coast, and it was hard to live or to imagine yourself as an American without them inland. Mark Twain has this extraordinary story about being in San Francisco in the 1860s, and he reports on the theft of oysters from a basement just before Christmas. And he says it's equivalent to burning churches, because he's I hope, being satirical, but his point is that it's hard to enjoy an American holiday without oysters, what it means to be a Virginian or an American. So to your point, yeah.
So it sounds, Matthew, then, as if the oysters were very much noted as and understood to be one thread in the fabric of the American identity.
I think that's beautifully said, and maybe I'll steal that from my book.
You can have it.
Yeah, I think it's an Atlantic people, and that, of course, is going to transform dramatically. But Americans imagine themselves, especially the dominant culture imagines itself as an Atlantic people well into the 1830s. And so if you can bring the Atlantic with you, even across the United States, as ultimately will become true in the transcontinentals, then you can carry with you that imagined national culture. Of course, the same period we're talking about now, in the 1830s, we're seeing huge numbers of immigrants, beginning to see large numbers of immigrants from unfamiliar places, particularly by the 1840s, Irishmen, Irish people who helped build these canals and those railroads and so on. Chinese immigrants into both California and the eastern United States, and of course the enormous presence of native peoples and also of Latinos in places like California, the Southwest, and beyond. Anyway, the transformation of the United States by these forces, by the transportation revolution and by immigration and ultimately by industrialization and the rise of the city, all of these I think we can see as in microcosm on this canal boat carrying these oysters. Oysters didn't only follow paths made by the artificial rivers. They also followed paths created by other goods. And this is also maybe an answer to your question, another answer to your question, Andy, and that is that for some Americans, certain kinds of entrepreneurs in particular, they were very much literally invested in driving change in what people ate and how they ate it and who could eat what. And one of the most remarkable of these business transformations in the 19th century, to me, is the ice trade. This wonderful image is taken from a landscape architect's work. And what she has done is reconstructed in visual form, this is only one of several slides, the Walden Pond global ice trade. And of course, Henry David Thoreau wrote about Walden Pond's ice trade, and he calculated what it was worth and how much ice came out of the pond, and also discussed where it went. Ice was a global trade good shipped out of the American Northeast. Even a relatively small water body like Walden Pond produced immense quantities of ice, and they traveled the world. And in the holds of these ships that went to Calcutta, for example, carrying Walden Pond ice, Calcutta, India, in those holds of those ships could travel other foods, other things. And they could travel in two ways. One, the ice trade pioneered a new kind of route, new kinds of trade routes and pathways and economic relationships, so you could send other things down that same path. And they also permitted you to ship goods which were more perishable, including oysters. You could send oysters long distances now, as long as you accompanied them with ice. And so let's see if I can bring up there we go. So oysters blaze, I should say, they follow the path blazed by ice that allowed other foods to circulate globally. And that transformation of the American diet, this combination now of refrigeration and the railroad, or the steamship as well, this has transformational consequences for the American diet. And this, I think, many of us are probably more familiar with. Here is an oyster car, the Stillwell oyster car, on the Kansas City, Pittsburgh, Kansas, and Gulf Railway Company. This ran from Sabine Pass, Texas, up to Kansas City. Here we are in Kansas City in 1897. That's a car full of live oysters. And so American oysters are traveling into the interior. They are feeding people in ways that were unexpected and unlikely, and they were connecting very distant places like the Gulf Coast to interior of Kansas and of Missouri.
Matthew, just let me ask you a quick question from Tammy Sweeney, just as a point of clarification.
Sure.
Tammy, just like some clarifying a question. So there's a global trade in ice. Ice was the actual trade good. It wasn't just a shipping strategy, correct?
Yes, thanks for that question. I appreciate that. Indeed, people treasured ice. Ice was one of the great luxuries of the 19th century. And you know, if you look at the actual map of destinations, which I did not include here, they're hot places. So people with money who can afford it are buying Boston and New England ice, and they're drinking it in their cold drinks in Rio de Janeiro, in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, and in Calcutta. So your gin and tonic in British India is being cooled by ice from Walden Pond. That's the good. The good itself is ice. And I know that sounds extraordinary. Think about that. Shipping water, frozen water, around the world in the holds of ships. But there's a market for it, and people make a living through this kind of market. So ice is itself a commodity, becomes a natural good which can be sold for profit. And it also pioneers these new trade routes. So I'm going to try to, there we go. There's our next slide. So American oysters moved along the canals, they moved along these steamer routes, and they moved on the railroad. And in fact, they traveled all over the world by water. After the Civil War, oyster entrepreneurs converted what had been a regional food to a global product for faraway markets in Europe, in Western Canada, and even Hawaii, as this image shows. From 1885 to 1898, so in that nearly 15-year period, the average shipments of in-shell live market oysters to Europe just from Connecticut was 100,000 barrels a year. So between 1885 and 1900 roughly, just the Long Island Sound growers just on the Connecticut shore were shipping 100,000 barrels a year of live oysters to Europe. Most of it went to England, which had its own oyster crisis at the time, and another good chunk went to France. That's a remarkable trade because, like ice, oysters are heavy and they're not particularly high value in the 19th century. But even more remarkable to me than the actual trade in adult food oysters is their travel as a living crop. By the 1820s, growers in New Haven in Connecticut were importing live oysters from Virginia to plant in Long Island Sound. New Englanders had already begun to overharvest their beds, and these entrepreneurs hoped that they could replenish their beds by planting what they called seed oysters, very small oysters from Chesapeake Bay. By 1900, this project was so successful that New Haven oyster growers were transplanting Chesapeake Bay seed and then raising it to adult size and then selling it to distant places. By 1900, New Haven alone was producing as many as 2 million bushels of seed each year. So New Haven was transporting seed from Chesapeake, spawning growing those oysters to adult size, spawning them, and then once again capturing the seed and selling it elsewhere. That is the origin of the Atlantic oyster trade in San Francisco Bay, in Yaquina Bay, in Gig Harbor, in the Puget Sound region generally, in Willapa Bay, and ultimately even experiments in places as far afield as Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. So we're talking about a global trade and a living crop. And so I like to think of this as oyster growers here as creating a new kind of biotechnology that paired oyster biology and human mobility. It's a biotech. They're taking this animal, transforming it, and moving it around the world. So I called it assisted migrations here in honor of the ecologist Charles Elton, who blamed the oyster industry for facilitating invasive species introductions worldwide. He said it was the greatest agent in moving marine animals to new corners of the world, Charles Elton said of the oyster industry. So here's this extraordinary animal, extraordinary to me anyway, this humble animal, making these long trips and transforming the places it goes, bringing with it the entire intertidal zone as it travels to San Francisco Bay, for example. But what about that city that we were focused on? Well, this image of Mulberry Street in Manhattan in 1890, not too far from the 5 Points image we got before, is supposed to be a reminder of a new kind of city, a city transitioning from the organic city into the industrial city. American cities exploded over the course of the 19th century. In 1840, less than 2 million Americans, about 11% of the population, lived in cities. By 1920, the urban population was 54 million people, more than half of the US population. So both in total numbers and as a percentage of the US population, the city is utterly transformative over the course of those decades, really in a single human lifetime. You see people changing the way they lived and where they lived. And also look at this picture. Look who an American was. Jewish people, Italian people, Chinese people. You have this enormous range of immigrants who are transforming who is an American and what that means. And I think it's not an accident, and it's deeply helpful to look at this image and see how it's focused on food. Look at all that food that dominates our picture here. Because this urban transformation that so remade the American experience really created two kinds of crises for the city. The first was how to feed it. How do you feed that immense concentration of people packed into a small area? And how do you keep it clean? So those two great questions, how do you survive in the city that's so choked with humanity without getting sick, for example, and how do you feed it? These two come together in the transformation of the oyster industry. And this image here shows what that oyster industry, how it began to transform in one of the two great places where oysters were remade to feed the city. This is Chesapeake Bay. Here we have African-American men tonging oysters, that is, using two attached rakes and grabbing live oysters from the bottom. These are natural oysters, that is, they're oysters that weren't planted, but instead were abundant in the huge beds of the Chesapeake Bay. These men were most likely hired by, perhaps by the men behind, but they were part of a much longer tradition in American history of working for yourself, of what people who even today call themselves watermen imagined as their own independent livelihood. But the key to oyster growing at the scale that could feed these massive new cities, the key to that kind of oyster growing was to treat the bay bottom like a farm. And in New Haven and in San Francisco Bay and in Puget Sound and elsewhere, growers lobbied governments to give them rights, full control, ownership, in fact, of the bottoms of the ocean, and in particular the nearshore areas like the ones on this map of oyster grounds in the state of Connecticut off the mouth of New Haven. So what these men were doing was treating oysters like agriculture, and they were treating them like industrial agriculture. They were seeding the oyster beds with tiny oysters imported from far away. They were weeding starfish out of their crop, and they were harvesting with huge steam dredges, not just with the handheld rakes of a previous generation, but with a massive new scale of industry that is something like factories at sea. So these steam dredges, for example, here's one from Popular Science Monthly in 1893. This is again on Long Island Sound in Connecticut. And what you see here is the expansion, the industrialization of aquaculture in the United States. These are oysters destined for the city. In 1911, Connecticut's oyster farmers produced more than 25 million pounds of shucked oyster meat, higher by far than their neighboring states, including New York. And by the turn of the century, oysters were far and away the most valuable seafood in the United States. In San Francisco Bay, which didn't even have native Atlantic oysters, the Atlantic oyster industry was more valuable, not only than salmon at some points in the 19th century, but also whaling, another great fishery of the West. So we're talking about Atlantic oysters, and yet they are big business now. Low price, high volume business, feeding the people of the city.
Matthew, I'm going to ask you a quick question as you move forward. And this question from Mike Cesario in some ways is an environmental question. It's an economic question. It's a cultural question. And that is, how long does it take for a seeded oyster to grow to harvestable size?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that depends on where you are, the quality of the water. In the 19th century, the New England, I should say the Long Island Sound producers estimated about 3 years for them to get from seed to market size. In the San Francisco Bay, however, the exact same seed oysters could get to market size in 2 years. And I speculated about that in my book and in an article, but a lot of it had to do with the quality of the water, and maybe not in the way you're thinking. The richer the water, the more fertilized it was, the faster the oysters could grow. And in San Francisco Bay, those oysters were parked off the sewers at the south end of the city so they could grow really fast. Remember oyster biology. Oysters filter tiny plants from the water, and so the more fertilized that water is, the faster they can grow. So the rule of thumb is maybe 3 to 4 years in the wild. It depends. And these days with the heat-treated or triploid oysters, you can actually do it in less than a year. My own oysters in the floats up in the Rappahannock River, I ate within 12 months, and they're good. Okay, good question. I like that. So I'm talking about a form of modern agriculture, industrial aquaculture. Oyster industry workers were hired men. They rode around and worked in steam-powered vessels. They used inputs like shell and seed. And most of all, they depended on markets, massive growing markets in the nearby cities. So there's a kind of, I think, unintentional, mostly unintentional, dependency between the waste produced by these new burgeoning cities with their inadequate or non-existent sewage systems and the massive uptake increase in the production of oysters in what are basically urban estuaries, right? Not far from Baltimore, not far from New York City, not far from Philadelphia, not far from Boston. You're seeing these massive oyster farms. So oyster growers were succeeding in part because they took advantage of what should have been a disaster, a huge increase in human and natural waste. And the secret to their success was to be mobile, to keep the oysters moving, to move them from place to place throughout their life cycle so they could benefit from the fertilized water, but also avoid being buried, for example, in all of the sediment accreting along the bottoms from erosion upstream. So I'm an historian, which means I can talk for hours. But what I want to do, instead of talking for hours, is to speed up a little bit and get to the high point of this story. Cities offered oystermen two kinds of markets. And one I think of as the Big Mac of the industrial city. Men like these on a street corner eating, in this case, clams, probably taken from Jamaica Bay and nearby, just off the shores of New York. But these are people, this oyster and this shellfish here is the food of the working poor. It was the cheapest, most filling protein that working people could get. And there's an amazing story here, I think a mostly forgotten story, about how oysters could be the first industrial meat, more so than hamburgers and hot dogs, which would come later and would replace oysters. Oysters were a basic food of the working poor in cities like New York. And they were a working poor food in places like San Francisco as well. But at the same time, they were also a food, in fact, a critical food of the most wealthiest Americans. And here we have what can only be called conspicuous consumption. Here's a banquet at the Hotel Astor in 1904. By the way, there are women in this photograph. They're at the back. See them way back there? They look like pineapples in those dresses back there. But, you know, in this kind of newly segregated in various ways, segregated world of fine dining, in which the whole point is to look at others and be seen while dining well. Oysters were also an absolutely essential food. They had what people today might call terroir. They had a name, a pedigree. And when people at the Hotel Astor ate oysters, they didn't eat the same oysters that the people on the street ate. They ate oysters that came from fancy places. They ate oysters that had names. And I know this because I've been working on this digital history project for some time using this amazing source at the New York Public Library, the What's on the Menu project. Perhaps some of you have helped contribute. They have something like 40,000 menus, and there are now well over 1 million. I think we're pushing 2 million now, dishes that have been transcribed by people from these menus. It's an amazing big data set about what people ate and where. And so here's a menu on the right here. This is Hans from 19th of February, I think 1900. You can see oysters got their own category on the menu. And what I've been doing is mapping with this amazing graduate student here at NC State, mapping where oysters were eaten. And what that shows us, what this story is telling me, is that oysters became a kind of key conspicuous food of the nouveau riche. To eat out, you had to eat oysters. They were on every menu, and especially on celebratory menus. Even as people out in the street were eating oysters without names, but that were also a key food. So cheap food and a conspicuous luxury. The other thing that those menus show me, though, is that the named oysters come from all over the place. This leaves out the Pacific Coast, which in the 20th century will start producing lots of oysters that show up on Manhattan menus. But just look at the density and the variety of places that oysters come from as they flow into and up to the restaurants of Manhattan. So Manhattan is becoming a giant mouth that is eating the oysters of the entire Atlantic coast and beyond. So this is a golden age of the oyster. But as we know from Mark Twain's description of the golden age, the gilded age, he called it, it was also a time in which what looked great could be rotten underneath. This is a period, the late 19th century, in which there are no tort laws, no regulations protecting consumers. And the age of the oyster was also the age of fear, especially in the city. And so the rest of the story of the oyster is a more familiar one, perhaps. It's the story of the collapse of the urban oyster. People were deeply afraid of what they ate in the 19th century, to a degree perhaps we cannot understand today. Because consumers rightly feared their food and their water. Disease was always a fearful threat in the organic city. Human waste was never really a problem for the oysters themselves, but oysters were filter feeders, so everything that they took up, every drop of water, no matter what was in it, went into the oysters, including the microbes that populated the street and 1 million human digestive systems. And you see photographs like this one, perhaps some of you have even used this in your teaching, these images of open sewers and dead horses on the street and children playing in that filth, these are commonplace images of the organic industrial city. Oysters had been suspected of carrying disease for many years, at least since the 1840s. But a series of oyster panics in the late 19th and early 20th century damaged the industry badly. The age of the city saw a new kind of Columbian exchange, where urban migrants carried with them new diseases, even more virulent diseases, from abroad, and concentrated those in the cities. Cholera, typhoid, yellow fever, even the plague reappeared in San Francisco in the early 20th century. And so one extraordinary response, and I've argued elsewhere in a recent publication, that oysters were actually essential, crucial to the passage of the first American food safety legislation. The US Department of Agriculture, and ultimately the Food and Drug Administration, would begin to police the places where oysters were shucked. And local public health departments began to enforce zones in which oysters could not be grown near cities. So if typhoid were in the water, or they suspected that untreated sewage was getting into water, they could prohibit the harvest or the production of oysters in places like New Haven. The irony, however, is that public health officials could prevent oyster farming in urban waters, but they did not have the authority to halt the pollution that was fouling those waters. They could regulate food, but they couldn't regulate the environment. And so oysters were a casualty, a kind of unintended casualty, I think, in part of a new regulatory boom. But that's not the only thing that killed off the urban oyster. I mean, photographs like this one of Rosie, the unnamed, no last name. She is this 7-year-old oyster shucker in 1913. What they remind us of is that the industrial oyster declined right about the time that public health laws, food safety laws, child labor laws all came onto the scene in the US. Children started to go to public school, not to work in factories or oyster canneries. So oysters,
Matthew, let me interrupt you briefly. First of all, these are beautiful images, and I particularly like this one.
Yes.
Given your own research, given your own work in the archives, your work to uncover these kinds of images, has there been any equivalent to a publication like The Jungle, or is this just kind of little bits and pieces that you're able to put together after the fact? And part of this question comes from Pamela Rickman.
Yeah, it's a great question. I like that. I actually have looked for, I would love to find an equivalent of The Jungle. I don't, but I have looked at, I guess we could call them gray literature or white papers. There were numerous groups who lobbied for food safety legislation in the late 19th century. The National Consumers League was one of them. Women's groups were at the forefront, as we know, of the progressive movement. And many of these groups, whether they were concerned with the consumer or whether they were concerned with child labor, in this case, lobbied for changes to labor law, but also to food safety and packaging and even labeling. Chemists were also crucial. Actually, the Organization of Chemists was a big backer of food safety legislation. So they all produced reports, and those reports are fascinating, I suppose, if you're an historian. But I can recommend a couple of great reports from the USDA. One called Sewage Polluted Oysters that I can recommend afterward, and I think it may even already be in our list of recommendations. So I want to wrap up so we can move on to talk about how to use documents, and that's what Kim is really going to lead us into here in a moment. But I want to point out, of course, I just said that regulation had helped perhaps to kill off the urban oyster. But let's remember what the progressives did. That this formula, this handy formula of taxes plus regulations equals public health, it's a reminder of just how dramatic the transformation of American health was as Americans taxed themselves, as the progressives and generations thereafter taxed themselves and regulated themselves to reduce the threat from their food and their water. And I just pulled out life expectancy for Black men and white men in 1900 and 2010 from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And what you see is this extraordinary transformation for the better in the quality of American lives. The other thing that is not so obvious here is who dies at what age. And it's children, especially children who die of many of these diseases on the left-hand column here in 1900. These are diarrheal diseases, diseases of poor water, bad air, and dangerous food. And that is the consequence of these extraordinary interventions, including the ones that may have helped destroy a fairly sustainable urban aquaculture movement. But where I want to end is to think now about the present and the future. This is one of my favorite places in the world, the Hog Island Oyster Bar in San Francisco. Look at that beautiful bridge in the background, the Bay Bridge, the Great Bridge of the Bay Area. And the ferry, we have a kind of 19th century city returning here in the San Francisco Ferry Building in this image. But of course, it's not the same, is it? It's a lot cleaner and a lot safer and a lot more expensive. And the people who are eating oysters in the oyster moment of our time today are mostly not working class people. Oysters, except maybe in places like the coastal South and in New Orleans, which is always an exception, except for those places, oysters have become a food of the rich, or of people like me who are foodies and can afford to spend a little bit of money for the high quality named oysters that you see on the wall here. So one kind of oyster has come back, but we're not seeing the kind of sustainably produced, urban connected oyster of the 19th century. Or at least that would be my challenge to you, perhaps, to think about. Oyster growers still operate in a commons. They're still dependent on an environment that they share with people upstream. They're still dependent on fragile economic and natural systems, but the breadth of their market is smaller and richer. And I wonder if that's as healthy in the long run for the business as the 19th century oyster was. So oysters have, of course, another rebirth in our own time, and that is as ecosystem engineers. Can oysters help us adapt to our profound challenges in the city of the 21st century? How can we help them to help us to adapt to sea level rise, urban growth, and the other threats from to urban growth from climate change? So environmental history to me is about relationships, about the relationship between human beings and the natural world. What might that be? What might that relationship be between the urban human population, most of which now lives less than 50 miles from the shore, and these animals that have been our companions now for these 10,000 years? So I want to turn it over now to my colleague, Kim Gilman, to lead us through how we can use this story and documents to better understand the environmental history of the city. And I also want to start reading your chat comments. Thanks.
Hi there, that was great, Matthew, and the chat box is really going. We've generated a lot of discussion and a lot of questions. I hope you have a chance to look over some of that, a lot of things that you can respond to. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can advance the slide here. Oh. Okay. Might need some help for Andy getting back.
Yeah, sorry about that. There must have been a live link. Hold on one second.
Okay. It is a great video if you want to watch it sometime. It's in the,
There. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry about that, everybody. I think there was a link on that slide, and when I clicked it to advance, it took me straight to the internet. My apologies.
And so that live link will be in the folder of resources we're going to provide for you. So if you do want to watch it, it is a really interesting video talking about this restoration project, which involves a lot of students, which is really cool for me. So I mentioned earlier that I work with pre-AP and ESL students, which means that we really need to get kind of explicit in how we do things. And so to do that, we have to make the invisible kind of visible and meaningful. And that's a theme that Matthew and I have been playing with since last summer. And so these are just some of the connections that that kind of popped into my head and with the curriculum that I have and that I know my high school has. So I don't know if these resonate with you, and I'm going to kind of also look in the chat box as you're going. So if there's something here, I don't know what all your subject areas are. I've noticed several comments, but just thinking about some general areas like geography and how might this theme tie in. You could talk about the theme of movement, of course, right? We've got the assisted migration, we've got the movement of disease, we've got the movement of a fad or a fashion of food. And then, of course, the theme of human-environment interaction. And we're going to explore some of these with some resources here in a moment. And I saw somebody in the chat talking about Jacob Riis. How would we tie in readings, how the other half live? Matthew, you mentioned Jack London. And there's a wonderful article that goes a little bit more into this and about this. Jack London was in an oyster patrol later because there was oysters were such a hot commodity in the San Francisco area that people were they were like oyster pirates who were stealing the oysters and beating up the patrol or the guards for the oysters. And then there's a Thoreau connection with Walden Pond and ice, and there's so many things that you could do if you are someone who works with literature. If we want to do world history, Matthew started out there talking about indigenous use of oysters, which tended to be more sustainable, and you could dig into that. Someone on here is in the archaeology field. That's wonderful, and pointed out the mounds of oyster shells and other things that you could look into. You could also look around the world at indigenous people along coasts that may be using bivalves for their food source and how they use those and for food and ceremony. American history, we can really just kind of run with it, anything from the 1800s into the up till present. And starting perhaps with urbanization with this story, the child labor photos, several of you pointed that out, and we're going to get into some of those here in a moment. Invention, technology, westward movement, all of these kind of things would tie in. Tying together the humanities and science doesn't always strike people as an easy connection, but it actually is. Here we've got, again, migrations, introduced species, keystone species. I'm from Kansas. We would probably want to talk about the buffalo, which is another keystone species. And we could talk about all of these ties that these species have and how we're a part of nature, not totally separate from it, and the things that we do impact that, as we can see in the history of the oyster. Epidemiology, the spread of disease, the bacteriology, which was an emerging field at the time of the oyster heyday, and again, climate and human environment interaction or impact. And then if we wanted to just talk about skills, we could talk about mapping, the movement of the oyster. There's this great tool that's free, and it's called Tour Builder, and I had my students do it, where it creates kind of like a, in this case, it wouldn't necessarily be a road trip, it'd be a rail trip, but you could trace on a map, and then students can load in images and commentary and video and trace anything really, but the oyster would be a kind of a cool one, and then show other things that were happening in those areas at the same time. And in just a moment, we're going to take you through some analysis and some interdisciplinary connections here.
Kimberly, let me ask you a quick question before you move on. You know, it's interesting, you and Matthew as a pair have, in some ways, sort of the opposite backgrounds, right? You're a social studies teacher who understands and values the description of the environment and the physical landscape and the ways that human interacts. Matthew has a background in environmental sciences, who then became an historian. So I guess my question for you in terms of these classroom applications, how do you see approaching your science teachers or your colleagues across the hall, so to speak, for these same kinds of things? There's a storytelling component here that seems to speak well in both disciplines.
That's right, and that last wording there says interdisciplinary connections, because right. I think you mentioned earlier that sometimes we teach in silos. You know, we kind of get in our content area and we focus on that. But if we start reaching out, and the kids are already doing this, because your students will be saying, oh my gosh, this is like what we did in this other class, or oh my gosh, I see a connection here. It's in a way, they're almost more open to it sometimes than we are as adults, and you know, so focused on our areas. And so I think it's a really cool way to bridge, and that's what I like about environmental humanities, is it's almost the intersection of all of the humanities together.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me try to advance here. Okay, let me make sure we're on the right one. All right, this is an exercise that I like to do, and I know some of you mentioned that you had low readers or ESL students, and this is a kind of a neat way for them to visualize their thinking, and it also causes them to grapple a little bit, which I think is a good thing, because they don't, it's not, they have to come up with it themselves. It's not apparent. So you could do it with vocabulary, or you could just give them blank hexagons like this. And the reason that I like this instead of maybe something more linear is that it has connections on all the different sides. So I just did one. It didn't take very long because there's so many connections here. And I started down in the bottom with oysters, and then I just kind of began thinking about some of the things that were coming up. And you can do this with your students as well, or with your staff members. This is a great way to visualize what you are thinking about as connections. And you can have oysters, and then I kind of went off into inventions and technology, which then led me to transportation and movement. And then the key with this is then that your students need to explain the connections. They don't write about them, they talk about them. You could do this with a little video. There's a tool, technology tool called Recap. That's a super easy way they could have this and then show it and talk about it. So here's something that you could do. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of bring up two things, and I'm going to ask people in the chat box to just respond quickly with some connections that they see. So I'm going to say oysters and inventions. So how would you connect those two things? Just throw a couple things in the chat.
Thanks, Kimberly. And you can see that the fingers are starting to type furiously.
Yeah.
Railroads,
Right.
John says, culinary tools from Richard. Refrigerated rail cars from Andrew. Jennifer says, new ways to transport. Steamship by Pamela.
Wonderful. Okay, yeah, I can see that. Perfect. This is exactly what you could do with your students. And I love this as an entry point because it's kind of low barrier and there are no wrong answers. And they can use their own vocabulary, or you can help them by providing vocabulary for them. And so this is a neat little entry point that gets us really our minds going. How many connections can we make? Can we fill out the hexagon with connections all around? And then how do those things interact with the things that are farther out on our grid that we're building? Perfect. Okay, so that would be maybe an introductory activity that we could do to show some of these connections, and I really like it because it causes you to really grapple with that. And then what I'd like to do, if I can get let me see if I can advance here. Perfect. Is to do some analysis. And in my, not only in my school, but in my entire district, actually, we have tools that we use, and we're going to play with some of those. But I'd like to give you some choices. So I pulled out a couple of things that were either in Matthew's presentation or that were related to them. So number 1 is a map. Number 2 is a photograph. And number 3 is a menu. So could we just kind of do a little crowdsourcing right now and see which one of these you want to do for an interactive session right now? Just throw a 1, 2, or 3 in the chat, and we will go with the most popular. Andy, can you help me?
You know what I'm really going to do, though, is I'm just going to pick the one that I want. It's interesting. I can see all these flying by. I'll tell you my thinking.
And a lot of twos.
I think my thinking is, we do so much with maps. I think we understand maps generally speaking. I think many teachers understand photographs and how to use them, but menu is kind of a new primary source document. And it's one not only that has an historical archive, the New York Public Library archive that Matthew mentioned, but it's also something that's in our daily lives. So let's do number 3, the menu.
Great, and I'm glad you mentioned that because the digital humanities is where it's at. It just gives us access to so much of the record, and using something from that archive that Matthew mentioned, I'm so excited. I hadn't really thought about using menus. All right, so let me get to, there it is. So as you saw with the photograph there's a tool for everything. We have an acronym for everything, and then we have specific questions that we prompt the students. Because again, my students need a little extra help to be analyzing something. So if we were going to analyze a document, which this is, we would use something called AP Parts. You may have heard of it. It is used on some college campuses. And so AP Parts just prompts us to look for certain things: the author, the place and time, the setting. What type of prior knowledge we would need to understand the source, the audience, who was it created by, who was it created for, the reason behind it, the main idea, and the significance. And so what we would do is go through a number of questions, and we would have the students answer them by looking at it. And I don't know if they can zoom into their screens, Andy, so they can see it a little better, or is that something that you can do to zoom into the menu?
Likely not. I would say that probably they can zoom in on their own screen better than I can. I'm afraid that I might disrupt our session.
Okay, if you're able to zoom in on your home screen, go ahead and
Daisy confirms that they can. Yeah.
Perfect. That's wonderful. I really like to sometimes I like to print things off so my students can have something to handle, because so much is just on the screen. But this is great. So we have this menu, and so if we take a look, we would try to figure out who we think the author of the menu, what's their point of view, what kind of person or group or firm or restaurant in this case would be creating this. And so we can see at the bottom someone has penciled in, and we would make a note of this because with our sourcing and corroborating, we want to know if this is accurate or not, that this is from the Plaza Hotel. So we would look for the Plaza Hotel would be the author. Then we would look for the place and time. And are there any clues to the time? It's 1889, but if we take a look, we can see not only the date, but the time period, right? Because it's talking about Thanksgiving. Okay, and so it's pretty easy to find that Plaza Hotels in New York. We could then think about prior knowledge. This is the hardest for students because this is where they have to generate questions for themselves. So they basically think about, what do I not know yet? And how am I going to find that out? And sometimes we go to another source to corroborate and then also to find more information. So we might look up, where is the Plaza Hotel? What kind of a hotel is it? What would these prices compare to today? So these are types of things that we would do in prior knowledge. The next piece would be the audience. We'd go through the audience and we would ask questions like, for whom was this created? What type of person might be using this menu? What would they think of the menu? Why does the menu look the way that it does? So what is it that they created the menu to do, or whatever it is? And you can use AP parts with a speech, you can use AP parts with the Constitution, with anything. And then we start to dig into the reason. Why are the things that are on this menu? And that's where this really ties in with what Matthew is saying. Why do we have these different dishes? And again, it's $18.99, and we see that we've got Philadelphia chicken, we've got things from Maryland, we've got things from that are traveling, Delaware grapes, Niagara grapes. We've got things that are not necessarily right local to this place. And then we have quite a variety. So this is a really great place where we look at the reason, why do we have this many different items on this menu in $18.99? We could also compare it to another menu. We could pick one that's older than it, and then we could pick a menu today and kind of compare those. And then we start to we've deconstructed the menu by picking it apart. And then what we do is we have to put it back together and synthesize the information that we have pulled out of it. And that's where we start to connect it with the main idea. Maybe it's what we're learning about. Maybe we're learning about oysters, or maybe we're learning about Thanksgiving. I don't know, whatever topic it would be, the main idea. And then the significance and the story of this menu. And we would write, in my class, we would write about this and we would tell the story of this menu. So this is just one of the tools that we use. And we actually start these in the grade school. We do them in middle school, and then we continue them up into the high school so that they're prepared with it just gives a real structure for them, and they know exactly what to do when somebody hands them a document. Doesn't matter how long it is or how hard it is, they have a starting place. And I think that's really important for students to know how to start.
Kimberly, I think one other interesting point that we can make with a document like this, and maybe the reason why I chose the menu, is that so often we talk about primary sources, but if you really put yourself in the moment of that document, they seem to break down into either records or relics. That is to say, some primary source documents, I'm sure, were created to document the world with every intention of people later on reading them and seeing them and interpreting things. And then other things are just the detritus of our life. You know, probably the owner of this restaurant had no clue that 100 plus years later, we'd be using this in a webinar to understand the oyster. So it's a relic, right? It's just this kind of thing from our life that lingers and we can look at later. And it might be an interesting distinction to make with students.
And it's a great point, because the historical record, there are things that are purposeful, and then there are things that we have by accident.
Exactly.
And why are some things saved and why are some things not? Ask a student, how many menus do you have? So and then that leads to more and more conversation.
I'd also like quickly, before you advance the slide, Kimberly, to draw attention to a comment that Matthew made in the chat box, which I thought was just eloquent. I'd encourage you to scroll up, in fact, to read it first person, and that is to really see history as a foreign country, to really acknowledge that the people who lived in these other times were remarkably different from who we are now in terms of their sensibility, in terms of what they came to assume to be true, the way they organized their identities. And really, we're asking students to take a passport into the past. And this is a really interesting way to look at that sort of very intimate, personal sense of how we eat and how we feed ourselves.
Absolutely. But then also to look for commonalities and things that we share as well.
Correct. Thank you.
I just want to, since we have just a minute here, go through, I'm going to back up one slide. If we had chosen and just show you these tools that we've created, and I've provided more of them actually in this folder that we're going to share with you. Again, we have a tool like this for pretty much everything, and if we don't have a tool, we make a tool, or I make a tool, I should say. So if we had chosen the photograph, we would have done the same thing. We would have deconstructed the photograph by asking questions about the people. What types of people? What age of people? What are they wearing? What do their expressions tell us? What objects are there? Do they symbolize anything? Are they unusual? We would go get at the setting. We would look at any actions, and I love the expressions that we can see on the faces here. We would try to determine relationships, like perhaps the two boys who are touching there, maybe they're related, maybe they're both here working. And then we would then again reconstruct what we took out into some sort of summary or story of this photograph. And there's so many jumping off points here. And then if we go forward, if we had chosen the map, we have one called Toad Skis that we do that really prompts us to look for information about the map. And if there's not a title, then the students are asked to create a title so that they have to think about what is the map really telling them. And then we look for information, missing information, and again, then we summarize. So these are tools, we have them for cartoons, and I can share all of this information in the folder that we're gonna leave you with at the end. I have there we go. I have a rubric here for using these tools that is shareable, and also you can change it to meet your own needs. This one happens to be for social studies. And then here are the questions that I was going through with you. I'm not able to, there we go. And I just want to invite Matthew back into the conversation here to talk about what we have. Here's the Google, it's just a short URL, and that's where all of these resources are that we've provided for you, this presentation as well as these tools for analysis, and then contact information for both of us. And I know, Andy, we wanted maybe to talk a little bit more about the humanities in class, and I'd love for Matthew to be able to get back in and be part of this.
Sure, I'm here. I'm just listening to all these smart comments.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. Matthew, what is your impressions now? I mean, you not only study this and research this and sort of have added the scholarly spine. We've walked through the way to process this with younger students in the classroom. How do you approach this in your college classrooms?
Well, you said at the very beginning that you see teaching and the National Humanities Center webinars as kind of that things go both directions, that sometimes scholars can offer stuff to teachers, but the opposite is also true. And I've been struck all along from Kim's comments about how much more sophisticated, frankly, her analysis of images for teaching purposes is than the kind of training we get at the university. But that said, I really like to dive into actually the same kinds of sources that she pulled out for our workshop. I think the combination of different sorts of sources, a map, an image, a text, I think that combination gives greater perspective for students at whatever level, or for me, myself. So I like to mix up the kinds of materials I offer to students in the class. And I also don't use any kind of secondary material. I use only primary sources. So I appreciate taking the time to unpack what these documents have to offer.
Thank you.
Matthew, let me just interject a little bit. I love that this idea of multiple sources, and that goes to another skill, which is corroborating information that we're looking at, right? Which is super important, especially in today's world. I will often do, and you see some pictures here on this screen, I call them labs, and I even wear a lab coat. You can see me in my lab coat there. Yeah. And they're stations, basically. I'm sure other teachers do stations as well, but that way I can provide them with 6, 7, 8 sources. And then a lot of times I do it at the beginning of a unit where they don't have a lot of information and they have to make inferences, which I think is a great way for them to interact with the material. And then at the end, after they've learned the information, then we go back to those same sources and put it back together and come up with some final analysis.
Excellent. Are there? We have just a moment or two left. If anybody would like to pose a last question, but while I wait for that to appear in the chat box, I am going to ask you, Matthew, one last question to summarize your own talk, and that is: do you have any sense of the state of the oyster industry today, 2017? Tell us why oysters are definitely something you should order and eat the next time you have a chance.
I really ought to be paid for proselytizing for the industry. Well, look, I think the first thing I want to say, I think this is really important, is that the most heavily regulated and probably safest of all the seafood you can buy in the United States, and almost certainly the most sustainable seafood you can purchase in the United States, is the American oyster on any of the three coasts, whether that's so-called Japanese oysters, Pacific oysters grown in Puget Sound, or whether it's, or in California for that matter, or if it's Atlantic oysters grown in the Gulf of Mexico or along the eastern seaboard. Oysters are just tremendously good food, whether you can eat them in lots of different ways, and they are heavily regulated. And I think that's one of the secrets, frankly, to their success, is that growers ended up embracing regulation. And I think that's it's such a striking contrast to the way, for example, we have this kind of free-for-all Wild West attitude toward deep sea or pelagic fish like tuna. I think that oysters are at a really low production level right now relative to their historic abundance and to their capacity. So I think you're going to see a lot more of them in the future. If you don't like them, all I can say is try different ways of eating them. That'd be my big suggestion. Andy, one more thing is that you and I have both visited oyster growers in the eastern shore of Virginia, where you're from. And I visited others in Chesapeake Bay and have a couple of floats myself. And it is a remarkably fun, easy, and interesting way to engage with science, marine science in particular. So if any of you are coastal, go check out a piling. If you're not growing them yourself, just go check out a piling someplace along one of your shorelines and see what's growing on it. The Exploratorium in San Francisco is especially good at this.
I appreciate the way you frame that, and I've also heard you use the term many times. I think you did several times tonight, but actually referring to this in terms of farming and oysters as animals, and it really does sort of blur that distinction, that line between what we thought was true and then the way that we can see these sort of invisible creatures that tell us in blueprint the past for us so in such a deep way.
And we had a question here in the chat as well, and I was going to bring up dangers that are threats to oysters currently, and ocean acidification is one, isn't it, Matthew?
Yeah, they're sort of, they're going to be our best friends in the Bay Area and in other places, other coastal areas. They're going to be critical resource for us to prevent some of the damage from sea level rise. But they're also directly in the line of fire because ocean acidification is especially devastating for those baby oysters when they're floating about before they settle. It's a real crisis, and I think it's intriguing that the thing that might help us the most is the thing that's perhaps at greater risk.
Thank you. Not to be lost tonight, again, is the role of storytelling in both the study of the humanities and the study of the sciences. I want to thank Kimberly and Matthew for joining us tonight and leading this conversation. Thank you again, both Matthew and Kimberly, and we look forward to the Humanities in Class iBook that will be available soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all for the opportunity.
And I also want to thank all of our attendees tonight. We had a wonderful session. I really appreciated your comments and your thoughts. Tonight's session has been recorded and it will be on our YouTube channel probably within 48 hours or so. You can also access the PowerPoint and the associated materials that were curated and selected by Matthew and Kimberly and the pedagogical tools that Kimberly shared. So I would encourage you to take a look again at those documents, maybe stitch them together with what you learned about tonight. I want to invite you to join us for all of our National Humanities Center webinar series. If you follow us on social media, you'll have all the updates as they happen. That includes our very active Twitter feed, our Facebook page, and our Pinterest page. I know many of you do follow that, and we appreciate any time that you like or retweet or sort of push us out in terms of promotion. I'd also invite you and welcome your help in sharing all of this work with your colleagues, with your schools, with your districts, with your students. As free and open resources, this is our opportunity to extend this conversation and reach as many educators as possible. Tonight, when we're finished, the evaluation will pop up in your browser. And once you complete that, you'll be able to download your certificates. So please take a moment to do that, and I will leave the room open so that probably an extra 10 or 15 minutes to give you a chance to complete that. Our next session is scheduled for February the 8th. That's next week, 2 weeks from now, I should say. We'll be working with Diane Moore, who's the director of the Religious Literacy Project and is a professor at Harvard Divinity School. I'd encourage you to join. We have just a few slots left. The last time I checked, we were inching up towards that cap of 200. So we'd love to see you in 2 weeks. Have a great day at school tomorrow. Thank you again for joining us, and good night.